Great. And for attendees, we will be starting up in just about a minute or two with Eileen Lang. Just give people a couple minutes to join us here. Just wait about one more minute. Wonderful. Well, thank you everyone for being here with us today. And Eileen, thank you very much for being with us. It's wonderful to have you, and an honor to be speaking with you about this really important topic that all startups need to be thinking about. By way of background, Eileen Lang is broadly recognized as a pioneering female high-tech and internet executive. She was the founding CEO of Alta Vista Internet Software Incorporated. It was a subsidiary of Digital Equipment Corporation. Prior to that position, Ms. Lang was a senior vice president at the Desktop Business Group at Lotus Development Corporation, responsible for a $500 million global business. She has also advised CEOs and entrepreneurs as a board member, coach, and investor in women-led technology companies. Eileen joined Catalyst, which is catalyst.org, as their president in August 2003, and was named CEO in September 2008. Catalyst is a leading research and advisory organization advancing women in business leadership. After 10 years leading the organization, she stepped down as president and CEO in January of 2014 and was appointed an honorary director. She returned to the organization from March to August 2018 as interim president and CEO. Under Ms. Lang's leadership, Catalyst's revenue doubled, membership tripled, brand awareness quadrupled, and the number of Catalyst research reports and knowledge products increased tenfold. To sustain that growth, Ms. Lang continued to work with Catalyst as a senior advisor to the Changing Workplaces, Changing Lives Major Gift Campaign, which she launched in 2012 in conjunction with Catalyst's 50th anniversary. A first time for Catalyst, the campaign helped to secure well into the future Catalyst's longitudinal research and the development of women leaders globally. To honor Ms. Lang's legacy of inspiring leadership, a 2014 Catalyst established the Lang Legacy Fund, an individual giving program meant to sustain the growth she directed and honor her impact on the world of women and business. Her research and views on gender equity have been published in places like Harvard Business Review, Reuters, and HuffPost. In 2017, Ms. Lang received a Harvard Business School Alumni Achievement Award in recognition of her contributions to both business and society. In 2013, she was awarded the Foreign Policy Association Medal, and in 2014, she was named to the National Association of Corporate Directors Hall of Fame. From 2008 to 2014, she was a member of the National Board Development Committee of the Girl Scouts of the USA and served on the Global Agenda Council on Women's Empowerment at the World Economic Forum. She has served on numerous other private, corporate, and nonprofit boards. She currently serves as an advisor to the Women's Venture Capital Fund, TrueStar Corporate Board Services, and the Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocities. Ms. Lang earned her A.B. degree in history and literature from Radcliffe College and an MBA from the Harvard Business School. So Eileen, welcome and thank you for being here with us. You have such an incredible background and you have contributed so much to the advancement of women in the workplace and a lot of the trends we're seeing go on today. We're really excited to hear your perspective on what startups can be doing right now to help advance gender equity and eliminate implicit bias in their companies and company culture. So welcome.
Thank you. It's
and
really
I'd love
to be here.
And I'd love to start off with just some more detail and in-depth discussion of your experience, your background, your career, how you ended up navigating your way to Catalyst, and have that lead us right into discussion around implicit bias and how to reduce that in workplaces.
Okay, thank you. So as you mentioned, I majored in history and literature. but I actually hadn't planned to do that. I planned to major in math. And when I showed up at Radcliffe, which was the women's college that was a part of Harvard College, but somewhat separate, but all the same faculty and everything else, the guys in the Harvard math department told me I wasn't smart enough to major in math. So I majored in history and literature, and it opened up the world to me. I learned how to read and write, which was really important. Communication mattered. I guess mathematicians can just use symbols or whatever. But I always was good at that type of thing. And when it turned out that after I graduated, I actually ended up joining the computer industry. I had another friend who she had majored, I want to say, in history, and then she had a master's degree in Asian studies and spoke Mandarin and all that, and she couldn't get a job either. So she joined IBM, and I joined a very small computer consulting company. And what we said to each other is, here's an industry that's so desperate for talent, they'll even hire a woman, right? And that was the middle 60s. That was a long time ago. But a lot of things have gotten better. But overall, the assumption was that women would more and more become educated, equivalent to men, and they would pursue careers. And there were various things in society that were helping. But they would pursue careers, and eventually, but promptly, as they became qualified, would take their place in the professions, whatever it was that they were pursuing. Well, as it turned out, I knew about Catalyst from the time it started. I was in college. By the time I sort of worked my way through my career in the tech world, and it started out with computers. I was a technical editor and a technical writer, and I learned everything I know about computers in the early days from writing about them, and from writing documentation, and from writing proposals, and shaking the engineers and saying, now, exactly what did you mean by that? Or how does this work? And then I would write the sample programs that would, we're talking big computers in those days, right? This was even pre-workstations, but I learned all the basics. And then when there was a market crash in the early 70s, the company I was working for, which was a consulting company, was planning to go public. There was a market crash. There was a cash crunch in the early 70s, and we couldn't go public. It was a disaster. The 70s were a disaster in so many ways. So counter-cyclical, time to go back to school. And that's when I went to Harvard Business School. And I thought, if I have an MBA from Harvard, then I will never have to start over again, whatever happens. It's a really good insurance policy. In a class of 800, there were 33 women. I was one of those 33. It was mind-boggling. And I was married, and my husband had gone to Harvard Business School, but this was worse than when there were only 3 women in his class, right? And there were 33 in mine. So people thought, I had classmates who would say to me, is the reason you're here because you want to understand your husband better? And things like that. I mean, it was crazy. But that was then. Fast forward, we saw more and more opportunities opening up. And as I said before, the idea was that women would take their rightful place over time because we live in a meritocracy, right? I mean, the world is a meritocracy. That's what we all thought. Well, let me assure you that it's the myth of meritocracy, because that's what I learned when I got to Catalyst. I had had a career for decades in technology. And in 2000, when the market crashed again, we had just sold our company the week before the market crashed. And I used to joke, I couldn't give it away on eBay if it had been last week, if it had, if we had, if our closing were 1 week later. But I had led 3 .coms in 5 years. And I didn't want to do it anymore. And the beginning of the 2000s was a really tough time also, especially in the tech world. So I joined some boards. I invested in some early stage companies that women had founded. I was in the Boston area. That's why, until I moved to New York in 2003 to join Catalyst, my whole adult life was in the Boston area. And I stayed in touch with all sorts of people. And one day I got a call from a woman who had worked for me before, 2 decades before, who at this point was an executive search consultant, and she was working on the search for the Catalyst president. And she said, I want to make sure we get some Boston people into this search, blah, blah, blah. And so we were talking about various people who we both knew. And then I just said, well, what about me? I love Catalyst, you know? And she said, oh, that would be terrific. You'd be great, but you'd have to move to New York. And I said, I can't wait. I've been wanting to move to New York for 40 years. So this was terrific. Anyway, it wasn't just about moving to New York, but there were every single opportunity that I got that I had good times, I had bad times, easy times, hard times. I had 3 children. You know, they had to get used to this too. And by the time I came to Catalyst, it was interesting. Catalyst it was really known for women on boards, women in senior leadership, and doing a lot of data tracking. And the first thing that I did, I showed up in September, and in October, I launched a study that we did, our 5th study of women in the IT industry. So I read all of them and I said, oh my God, this is the story of my life. And so I could just see everything there. Now, I want to say that there were certain things that we learned over time about how women succeed. One of them is that they have to have, beyond mentors, they have to have sponsors. And I could see that. I started reflecting. Every one of the opportunities that I had, somebody had sponsored me for it. A sponsor is somebody who puts their credibility on the line. They have skin in the game. They recommend you. And if you screw up, then they look like mud. So it is, it's really important to honor your sponsors, but you only get sponsored if people really have a lot of confidence in you. And what I saw was that many of the opportunities that I was sponsored for came through people who had worked for me before. So even though we know it's really important to learn how to manage up, it's really more important to learn how to manage down. That being a leader means leading people, and there is a lot that comes with experience, but also we can have a lot of knowledge about it. Yeah, so you asked, yeah.
Eileen, I don't want to take you off track here, but you had mentioned to me the double binds for women in leadership positions, women in managerial positions, and I'd love to hear more about that.
Right. So we started studying stereotyping of women. This was the whole field of implicit bias, which was a psychology field, was becoming very popular. And people, it's based on implicit bias is just basically having knee-jerk reactions. I don't mean that in a critical way, but just immediate reactions, gut reactions about people, not because you know them, but because of a stereotype. And so we were trying to study what those were. And Catalyst did a lot of work around this. And we developed a report that was called the double bind, right? And this report was about stereotyping of women. And we came up with 3 big stereotypes. One we called the Goldilocks stereotype: too tough, too soft, but never just right. The second one was the double standard. Women are held to a higher standard than men. Ginger Rogers did everything that Fred Astaire did, but backwards in high heels. Most of you might not know who Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire were, but I can tell you they were this gorgeous dance couple, right? Ballroom dancing. And she did everything he did in a long dress, high heels, and backwards. And the third one was what we just called competent but disliked. And it turns out that men prefer women who let me say it a different way. It turns out that performance reviews, assumptions about women are always that it kind of fits into that too tough, but never just right. If she expresses her competence, if she is an expert, if she tries to stand on that, people just don't like her. I don't know how else to say it, but in politics, we see this kind of thing all the time. Every time a woman is up for some kind of leadership thing, all you hear about is what a bitch she is to work for. And so this idea of competent but disliked is critical, because it turns out when you then go and look at performance reviews, and we studied them, we did a big study about that. It was called Cascading Bias. And the study basically showed that if you look at performance reviews for women, they rarely focus on constructive, performance-oriented feedback. They are much more critical about her style. And it's shocking because it's so normalized. But the problem, obviously, with that is that women don't get constructive, performance-oriented feedback as much as men. They have to prove themselves over and over again. Men get promoted or hired on promise, what people think they can do in the future. Women have to prove with their performance record that they've done it over and over and over again. So women are much longer in grade, is what we like to call it. The runway is much longer, and it becomes harder and harder for women to advance because of these three double binds that hold them back. So
Is there an example about focusing on style versus performance? Because I would imagine in a lot of these reviews, people think they're going in and talking about performance, but because of these stereotypes that you're talking about, it's coming off as actually talking about style. So I'm just curious.
Yeah. So think of the word aggressive and think of the word assertive. They are two very different things, but they can describe the same behavior depending on whether you think it's appropriate for a woman to be speaking up or not. And if you use it, and there are pairs of words like that. And in fact, there's something on the Catalyst website that basically it's a program that was started a couple of years ago that's called #BiasCorrect. And it actually goes through pairs of words trying to show that, if you hear somebody say the word aggressive, say, well, let's look at that. What did she really do? Or how did she say something? Or was she just being assertive? She was making her point. She wanted to be heard. Men interrupt women, women interrupt women too, but I mean, the culture or a style is a lot of interrupting, talking over, things like that. And when you look at it, we used to see women, when they would read these reports, they'd say, oh my goodness, that is exactly what's happening. And when men would read them, they would say, how could that be? And we'd say, watch for it. And they'd watch for it. And sure enough, they saw it all the time. So that kind of leads us into what do you do to kind of interrupt those, that stereotyping, the bias, and the lack of peer respect and support for women that ends up being very personal. And you often don't see it for yourself, but I mentor a lot of young women, including my daughters. And I have to tell you, they would call me and tell me about these experiences. And I said, oh my God, I can't believe this is really happening to you too. But it is exactly that. And one of my daughters, who is very assertive, said that she kept pushing back in every performance review, basically saying, but what you're saying to me doesn't help me change my performance. It doesn't give me constructive feedback. I want something that's constructive, not just telling me that I talk too much, which might be the case, but it usually wasn't. She was usually over-prepared, so she had more to say in a lot of situations like that. So the style thing ends up that it seems like it is appropriate, but think about this in early stage companies. What if Elon Musk had been a woman? Would he have gotten billions of dollars of investment? What about Adam Neumann? Yeah, when you see these behaviors, then you know what aggressive is, right? So I think that with men, it's considered to be, well, that's just how the guys are. But with women, it is not ladylike. And that's really what's at the basis of this, that this ladylike behavior kind of trails along with us, and it can really get in the way.
Yeah. And if nothing else, it's just a good thing to be aware of going into these conversations.
Well, it is, because part of what we want to try to do is interrupt this. We want to change the game. We want to change the playing field around this. And we also want to be sure that we get the best talent. So if we have a lot of talented women who are not getting leadership roles, or who are not being promoted, or not getting a chance because they haven't proven they can do it, but a guy who hasn't done it has every opportunity to try, right? Then, we really want to interrupt it so that we have we have much better access to the best talent, and we reward it well, right? Yeah. This also plays into the gender pay gap. So think about it this way, and that's where, it gets very, very personal. It's not just about personal criticism. Think about it this way. Women, we know there's a gender pay gap. So we find that women will have to prove themselves, so it takes them longer to get a promotion. There's women with the amount of experience that they have not moved forward as much, so they're paid less. And then what do people think? Well, the people who are paid less aren't as good. She's just not as high performing, so she loses out in that opportunity too. And this is not personal. These are very, they're sort of social norms. And as I said before, kind of knee-jerk or at least gut reactions. And so how do we do something about this? And I think it's important. Most of the organizations that work on these things are very big companies. And I know I'm talking to people today who are not leading very big companies, might have come from some big companies, and so might have had some of this experience. But I think that what we're learning is that the culture matters, and the culture is set from day one. And therefore, there are things to always be aware of and work towards, because it will help make for a more successful company. And culture change is really hard. So later on, trying to fix it is much, much harder than kind of doing it the right way to begin with. So when I talk about this, I have to just say that in the old days, we always talked about diversity, and it was this idea that if you had diversity, that was good. And we did all these studies at Catalyst that showed that diversity in senior leadership, especially gender diversity, that's what we studied. That's what all our samples were. But it was good for business, but it was the smart thing to do. And we called these our bottom line studies. And we showed several where boards that had more women on average, the companies perform better. And in financial terms, these were looking at their financial performance over time. We also did them about companies that had more women in their senior leadership. And there were when there were more women there, I'll just give you a couple of examples. It was much easier to bring more women in. So being the first woman, the token, the whatever, it's hard on everybody. The first board I was on, they asked me to join. It was a tech company in Silicon Valley. I was the only woman, the first and the only woman. And the whole first year, it was like I had a fight to say anything around that table. And then we'd have a break and the guys would go to the men's room, and I could tell when they came out and I came out of the ladies' room that, they had made a lot of decisions. And so I said, we have to get more women on this board. And when we had 3 women on the board, it really, really made a difference. So that's personal experience, but it actually was documented in a lot of the work that we did.
Yeah, and on bringing more women into the table and giving more seats at the table, I'd love to hear your thoughts on hiring more women and hiring oriented towards inclusion. You talked about a really interesting study about blind auditions and how that's related to hiring that I'd love you to share.
Right. So the story that I told Courtney was that years ago, you never saw a woman on a symphony orchestra. She just was not there. Maybe she played the harp, but outside of that, you never saw a woman violinist. You never saw them on any of the wind instruments. You just didn't see women. And the assumption was, even though there were a lot of women who studied in the conservatory or whatever, that women just weren't really good at music. And oh, by the way, once they got married and had children, they were, their interests were somewhere else. They weren't going to work those hours or whatever. So there was a study done in at a symphony orchestra in Germany, where they said, let's have a blind audition. They put a curtain up. So nobody who was a judge could see who was auditioning. And it turned out that, they had one after the next, and all they could judge by were their ears, right? Hearing the music. And it started to make a change. Suddenly women were doing really well. And people thought, I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that a woman could play like that. Well, that same woman had played the same way a week before, but once they knew it was a woman, she was considered unacceptable. So this idea of blind auditioning was becoming very popular. What would that mean on your resume? You strip out all the pronouns. You strip out identifiers that show that if you were president of your sorority, let's say, you changed it so it was a president of an organization that did whatever. But you didn't have those identifiers on your resume. And that was considered to be kind of the right thing to do. I was telling the story at on a panel, and another woman who was sitting next to me said, well, I'm on the symphony, I'm on the board of the Chicago Symphony, and we tried this, but it didn't make any difference. And then somebody said, it's a wooden floor back there behind the curtain. We can hear the candidates as they walk across the floor, and we know who are women and who are men from their footfalls, right? So they put a carpet down, and she said, and then it started changing everything. So this idea of it being blind and deaf, well, not deaf when it's the music, but definitely not knowing who the person is. It might work for music, but the problem is that it strips away all of our identity. And the idea now around inclusion is it's not just counting noses to see if you have one of everything around the table. It is bringing people in, tapping into their expertise, their differences of perception, their differences of experience, getting people to not only have voice, but contribute to decision-making. And you want to have different people because there's some value in their differences. So you don't want to just camouflage them or block them out. And we call that bringing your whole self to work. But whatever your background is, we really want it to contribute to decision-making. And inclusion is really where we end up getting much better performance from our diversity, when people can express and they're respected and what they've done is valued. So that's very much a cultural norm. And there are different kinds of practices that can encourage this. And that's, I think, what I really wanted to kind of talk about how you move beyond this. And it is something, as we said before, that could start at the beginning of the business. Talent management is what this is all about. Talent management is a critical business function, and it needs to be respected, but also treated like a critical business function, which means there are goals, there are metrics, there are audits, there are all the things you do to make sure that you're doing the best job there, just like you are going to do the best job on your financials and on your sales and your customer service and all the rest. Talent management is serious business. There are a lot of policies and practices that get put in place. They might not be in place, too many of them at the beginning, but if you're starting up a company that's a financially oriented company, financial services of any kind, you've got a lot of policies that you are accountable for. And you have to have audits, and you have to start from the beginning. You can't sort of grow into it later after you've been breaking all the rules. So the idea of fair and equitable policies and practices, whether it's recruitment, And, we want to get beyond blind auditions, but if it's recruitment, think about this. In small companies, we often hire our friends. If our friends are just like us, then we're perpetuating homogeneity. But it's hard in a small company to feel comfortable hiring somebody you don't know. So, if you've got a wide circle of friends from many different communities or whatever, that might be different. We have much more diversity in all of the business schools now, and certainly a lot of the universities. So, maybe hiring friends is a good idea, but how do you get to know people who you don't know and who isn't a friend of a friend? And that's a hard thing. That's a hard thing to do. So we mentioned earlier that I'm an advisor to TrueStar Corporate Board Services. This is a boutique executive search firm that all they do is place women on boards of directors. They've been hugely successful. And the reason they have is they have an approach where what they say is interview the women first. So the whole idea is the board says we want to have some women on our board. And if they hire TrueStar, they make a commitment that they will interview the women first. And TrueStar says to them, we will work with you on the specs so we really know what you're looking for and what's important. And then we will find you candidates who meet the spec to a T. And if we can't find a woman for you, then you don't have to pay us. So, and we'll open the search up to men. But they've never had a failed search, and many of the engagements that they have completed, the board in the end couldn't decide between two top women, and so they brought them both on, right? Which was really good. Boards can expand their size whenever they want, so they can bring in another person. But TrueStar founders Beth Stewart and Beth and her team were able to find women who were rocket scientists, literally. I introduced her to one, somebody who I knew, and turned out she was a rocket scientist. And they found retired generals from the Air Force or from the military who had run these huge operations. Think of logistics if you run an Army base. Just think of it, how experienced that person is. So it's things like that, where it's looking at the experience, but not comparing women and men head on, because that's only going to work to the detriment of women. Same of this kind of thing is true if we're looking at racial diversity as well. That when you are comparing people against each other, it's very hard to clear out whatever the stereotypes are. And yet, you can look at them by taking that out of the equation, just changing that playing field. It turns out I don't know how many people know about the Rooney Rule, but that was developed with the NFL because 80% of the players in the NFL were men of color and 100% of the head coaches were white. So they said, why aren't any of our great players getting opportunities to be coaches? It turned out they were never being interviewed. The assumption was, I don't know, they weren't smart enough to be a coach or likable enough or whatever it was. So the Rooney Rule was that you always had to have one person of color on the slate, but the rest of the slate were all white, and just having one is tokenism. And it worked for a while because people said this is the kind of outcome we want, and then it stopped working. And especially the Black players just said, we're not going to just kind of go through the motions so that you can check a checkbox. You're either going to value me or you're not. So that doesn't work so well. The whole idea of just looking at women first, that's a terrific technique around in recruitment. And then I talked before about performance reviews, but it's really important to have rigorous, consistent, equitable performance review policies and do analysis. And what people usually do is they take, this is probably still done, but you can take all of the reviews in a certain department or at a certain level across departments or whatever, and then you look at them, you take out all the names and you just look at what are the descriptions, what are the adjectives that are used, and what are the rankings that are given, or the results, or the letter, however the system is that people evaluate it. And it turns out that when you do that, when you strip out all the identification information, you see that you're not getting representation. You're getting an 80-20 rule. 80% of the people are at the, that's not quite right to say the 80-20 rule, but 20, yeah, that 80% of the candidates, or let's just say if it's 50-50, if it's 50% women and 50% men, most of the highest ranking will not give you that bell curve, right? That's kind of what you want, is to have something that has a statistical framework that shows that it's fair. And so that's really important, whether it's around the feedback language, the score distribution, and there are practices around this that are highly accepted. And then using salary equity studies. So these are published they're available out there. You can always compare and see whether your staff are being paid equitably compared to the rest of the industry, or the goals that you're setting that you want. And then nothing beats anonymous employee satisfaction surveys and regretted loss interviews and surveys. But I have to say, if you're doing regretted loss and exit interviews, you won't get the information you really need unless you use external people who are not part of the company. And as long as it is anonymous, because who wants to burn their bridges? Who is really going, and who has been victimized is actually going to want to say, speak up when they're leaving. They just assume, you never know when you're going to cross paths with these people again. So all of those, it really means treating the policies and procedures very rigorously and scientifically. Workplace culture is a really important thing, and we've talked already about some of it, but it turns out one of the things that we've learned, and people's views about workplace culture are changing since the pandemic, and since so many people have been working at home, and since we're, I said earlier about bring your whole self to work. Well, now you bring your whole job to home. And so everybody is seeing everything, and it's very, very hard for people. So having a culture where people feel valued and recognizing that in person it's not going to be the same thing anymore. So I think we're adapting a lot of what we think about in work life, but you hear people talk about work-life balance, work-life management. There's a really simple way to think about it. People who do work have lives. That's it. They're people, they're not computers. So although if you like the movie Her, there you go, with Scarlett Johansson's voice, that's pretty amazing. But and then I'll just say this, leaders must lead and they must role model. And so you can't expect the team to do things that you say are the right things to do if you don't do it yourself. And it's really hard. Being a role model all the time is very tough. But around all of these kinds of practices, this is something that, gee, people are looking at me and they're watching me and I'm out there and I can't say, do it this way, and then I go and do something else. So, that consistency is really important. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is everybody's job. And so I know, Courtney, you asked me if there's one book that I would recommend for people to read. Well, right on the Catalyst homepage, catalyst.org, there is a 5 must-read books on workplace DEI. So go take a look, and you can pick any one you want, or you can read all 5 of them, or 2, whatever you want to do. I mentioned that bias correct tools before about kind of looking at language. People don't always, they kind of just react normally. And it's not like we want people to have to be strained or feel constrained. We want them to be comfortable. That's everybody, men and women. But there is a special role for men, though, and we talked about that earlier. Catalyst did a lot of work to say, it's one thing for women to mentor other women, but there aren't enough women in the most senior levels, at least in the old days, and it's probably still true now. less true than it used to be. But women can't do it all. The men in the power structure have to take some ownership of the situation. And so we developed a long stream of research about men as allies for women and what did they have to do. And when we did the research, we started out just trying to figure out how many, whether men were aware of the problem. It turned out only 20% of the men in this big study that we did were aware that there was any problem at all. That's probably changed by now, but we tried to figure out what was the difference between men who were aware of the barriers that women faced, whether it was a glass ceiling for white women or a concrete ceiling for women of color. How many men were aware? Well, it turned out there were 3 characteristics of the men who were aware. The first is that they weren't macho kind of guys. It wasn't all about the frat house or the locker room or whatever. They had more interests and more broadly. The second was that they had had a woman as a mentor. It might have been a boss, but it might have been a mother, older sister, might have been a wife. You just don't know. It wasn't a daughter, that's for sure. Now that's changed, I think, lately, but earlier when we did this work, it was really about having had a woman as a mentor. And Courtney, I think I might have told you this, that I once had a sponsor who, it turned out later, he told me years later, I worked for him. And he said the reason he wanted me on the team is that he had an older sister named Eileen. And so he said, so, I knew you were going to be good, like my older sister kind of thing, and I thought that was really sweet. And I mean, he gave me a break that was one of my first big breaks. So I felt really good about that. But then, so it's having had a woman as well, having deflecting macho norms kind of thing, not thinking macho terms, having had a woman as a mentor. But the third thing was about fairness and fair play. What's the right thing to do? And so then when we did our big study and we tested out all of these hypotheses, what we found was it's true, those are the 3 characteristics of the men who were aware, but the men who actually acted and became champions for women and sponsors and allies, there was only one thing that differentiated them from everybody else. It was about fair play. The people who were known for being champions, it was about fairness. And the idea that doing the right thing is a business value and a organizational value is very empowering to everybody. It makes everybody feel better if they think their organization is doing the right thing. So it's one of the things I say early on, get it started, set up a culture that, and embrace the culture that really does care about fairness and doing the right thing. Because if you do the right thing for your employees, it'll be good for your customers. There's lots of research that shows that anytime it'll be good overall. You'll probably not go to jail, and that's good too.
Well, thank you, Eileen, so much for all of these ideas, thoughts, research, tactical tips about what we can be doing now in our companies to create more fair workplaces for everybody. And it was an honor to be here with you tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you for your interest in this. You can tell how passionate I am about it. It's been, it was always my avocation until it became my job. And then after I retired, it's still my avocation. And it will behoove everybody. It's not easy, but it is so rewarding. And so such a key to success.
Well, I thank you from a personal perspective for paving the way. So
thank you. Thank you all for being here.
Have a wonderful evening, everyone.